The air was thick with tension as Juliet, David, and Ngozi remained frozen, their gazes locked on the armed men in front of them. The night felt heavier than before, as if time itself had slowed. The leader of the group, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit, took a step forward. "You thought you could run forever," he sneered, his gun aimed steadily at David. Ngozi tightened her grip on her weapon. "We're not running. We're fighting." The leader let out a dry chuckle. "Fighting? Against who, exactly? You don't even know who you're up against." Juliet's heart pounded. She wasn't a fighter, but she knew one thing. Giving up wasn't an option. Her fingers found David's arm, a silent reassurance that they were in this together. Suddenly, the driver revved the engine. "Hold on," he shouted. The car lunged forward, tires screeching against the pavement as the driver veered sharply to the left, narrowly missing the armed men. Gunshots rang out, shattering the night's stillness. Juliet ducked, pressing herself against David as bullets grazed the car's exterior. "We need to lose them," David yelled. Ngozi fired out the window, forcing the men to take cover. The driver pushed the vehicle to its limits, swerving through narrow streets, dodging traffic, and weaving through dark alleys. Juliet could barely breathe. Every second felt like a lifetime, the weight of survival pressing down on her chest. "We're almost there," the driver announced, turning sharply into an old industrial area on the outskirts of the city. "There's an underground tunnel ahead. We can hide there." David exchanged a glance with Ngozi. "We don't have a choice." The car skidded to a halt near an abandoned warehouse. Juliet, David, and Ngozi jumped out, following the driver as he led them to a hidden entrance covered with rusted metal sheets. With a quick push, the entrance creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow passageway leading underground. "In here," the driver urged. "It's safe." Juliet hesitated for only a second before stepping inside, gripping David's hand tightly. They had escaped for now, but she knew this was far from over. As the tunnel shadows swallowed them, one thought lingered in her mind. Whoever was after them wasn't going to stop. And neither were they. The damp air inside the underground tunnel was suffocating. Juliet's breath came in short gasps as she clung to David's arm, trying to push away the overwhelming sense of fear. The dim glow from Ngozi's flashlight barely illuminated the narrow passage, casting long, eerie shadows against the damp walls. "We need to keep moving," Ngozi whispered. "We can't stay here for long." David nodded, his jaw tight. "How far does this tunnel go?" The driver, who had led them into the hideout, responded without turning back. "It connects to an old railway system. If we can reach the exit near the abandoned station, we might be able to disappear before they track us." Juliet swallowed hard. "And if they find us first?" Ngozi gripped her gun tighter. "Then we fight." They pressed forward, their footsteps echoing through the tunnel. Each turn felt endless, each passing second dragging them deeper into the unknown. Juliet's mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. She had never imagined her life would come to this, running, hiding, fighting for survival. A sudden sound behind them made her freeze. A low, metallic clatter, as if something had fallen. Her heartbeat quickened. David turned sharply. "Did you hear that?" Ngozi signaled for silence. The group stood still, ears straining to pick up any hint of movement. The tunnel was silent, but the tension was thick, pressing down on them like an invisible force. Then another sound, a faint shuffle, distant but deliberate. "They found us," the driver muttered. David took Juliet's hand. "We have to run." Without hesitation, they sprinted through the tunnel, the dim light barely guiding their way. Juliet's lungs burned, her legs growing weak, but she didn't dare slow down. A gunshot rang out behind them, echoing like a thunderclap. Juliet flinched, gripping David's hand tighter. "We're almost there," the driver called out. "Just a little more." As they rounded the final corner, a faint light appeared in the distance, the tunnel's exit. But standing in front of it were 3 men, their guns aimed directly at them. Juliet's heart stopped. There was no way out. Juliet's breath hitched as she took in the sight of the 3 armed men blocking their escape. David instinctively stepped in front of her, his body tense. Ngozi slowly raised her gun, her finger hovering over the trigger. The driver cursed under his breath. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, smirked. End of a line. David clenched his fists. What do you want? Scarface chuckled, tapping his gun against his palm. The files. The evidence. Hand it over, and maybe we'll let you live. Juliet's stomach twisted. They had fought too hard, risked too much. Giving up wasn't an option. Ngozi tightened her grip on her weapon. And if we refuse? Scarface's smirk widened. Then you die here. Silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Juliet could hear the faint drip of water somewhere in the tunnel, the only sound aside from their heavy breathing. Then David did the unexpected. He lunged. Chaos erupted. Gunshots rang out, echoing off the tunnel walls. Juliet dropped to the ground as Ngozi fired back, hitting one of the men. The driver tackled another, sending them crashing into the damp concrete. David wrestled with Scarface, their struggle fierce. Scarface swung his gun, but David ducked, landing a solid punch to his ribs. Juliet scrambled forward, searching for something, anything, that could help. Her fingers closed around a rusted pipe lying on the ground. Without thinking, she swung it, striking Scarface across the back. He grunted, stumbling. David took the opening, knocking the gun from his hand. More gunshots. The driver fell, clutching his leg. Juliet's heart lurched, but there was no time to check if he was okay. Ngozi fired again, taking down the last attacker. Panting, she turned to David. We have to go. Now. David grabbed Juliet's hand, pulling her toward the exit. They stumbled into the open air, the cool night breeze hitting them like a shock. Behind them, the tunnel was silent. They had made it out, but Juliet knew it was far from over. Juliet's legs felt like jelly as she and David sprinted away from the tunnel's entrance, their breaths ragged and uneven. Ngozi stayed close behind, her gun still gripped tightly in her hand. The night air was cool against Juliet's skin, but it did nothing to ease the heat of fear running through her veins. We can't stop here, David muttered, glancing back. They might have more men nearby. Juliet nodded, forcing herself to push forward. Where do we go? Ngozi slowed her pace, scanning the darkened streets ahead. There's a contact of mine, someone who owes me a favor. He can help us lay low until we figure out our next move. David didn't hesitate. Lead the way. They moved cautiously, slipping through quiet back streets, avoiding the well-lit main roads where they could be easily spotted. Every distant sound made Juliet's heart skip a beat. She felt like a hunted animal, always one step away from being caught. After what felt like an eternity, Ngozi stopped in front of a small, run-down apartment building. The flickering streetlight above cast eerie shadows on the cracked walls. Are you sure this is safe? Juliet whispered. Ngozi gave a small, reassuring nod. It's safer than the streets. She knocked 3 times on the wooden door of apartment 3B. A few moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a man in his 40s with weary eyes and an unshaven face. His gaze flickered over the group before settling on Ngozi. Ngozi, he said, surprise evident in his voice. Isaac, we need a place to hide, she said firmly. Just for a night. Isaac hesitated for only a second before stepping aside. Come in. Juliet stepped inside, her shoulders sagging with relief. But she knew deep down, this was just the calm before the storm. Juliet's heart pounded as she stared at the armed men blocking their escape. David positioned himself protectively in front of her, while Ngozi steadied her grip on her weapon. The tunnel exit was so close, yet the danger before them was impossible to ignore. Scarface, the leader of the group, smirked and raised his gun. "You really thought you could get away, didn't you?" David's jaw clenched. "We're not handing over anything." Scarface laughed. "Brave words, but you're outnumbered." He motioned to his men. "End this." A shot rang out before anyone could react. One of Scarface's men stumbled back, a red stain spreading across his chest. Ngozi had fired first. "Run," she shouted, pulling the trigger again. Juliet and David didn't need to be told twice. They sprinted toward the exit as bullets whizzed past them, the tunnel echoing with gunfire. The driver stayed behind, returning fire as he provided cover for them. Juliet's lungs burned as they burst into the open air. The night was eerily silent compared to the chaos behind them. David grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the dense alleyways of the industrial area. They had no time to think, only to move. Ngozi followed close behind, her gun still clutched tightly. "We need a car. Fast." Juliet glanced around desperately. Then she spotted an old truck parked near a loading dock. "There." David ran ahead, checking the vehicle. "Keys are inside." They climbed in just as Ngozi fired another shot toward the tunnel entrance. Scarface and his remaining men were closing in fast. "Go." Ngozi yelled. David slammed his foot on the accelerator, the tires screeching against the pavement. The truck lurched forward, speeding down the narrow road. In the rear-view mirror, Juliet saw Scarface standing at the tunnel's edge, his furious expression illuminated by the streetlights. Juliet let out a shaky breath. They had escaped, for now, but she knew Scarface wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted, and that meant the fight was far from over. Juliet held onto the dashboard as the truck sped through the narrow streets. David's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his jaw clenched in determination. Ngozi kept her gun ready, glancing back every few seconds to make sure they weren't being followed. "We need to get as far from here as possible," David muttered. "Scarface won't stop hunting us." Ngozi nodded. "I have another contact, someone who can help us disappear." Juliet turned to her, desperation clear in her eyes. "Who?" "An old friend," Ngozi said. "He used to work in intelligence. If anyone can hide us, it's him." David swerved onto a quieter road, the city lights flickering in the distance. "Where do we find him?" Ngozi pulled out her phone and quickly typed a message. "I just sent him our location. He'll meet us at a safe house outside the city." Juliet exhaled, gripping her seat. "Let's just hope we get there in one piece." Minutes later, they reached the outskirts, an area filled with abandoned buildings and factories. David parked the truck behind a rusted warehouse, turning off the engine. Silence filled the air except for the faint hum of crickets. Ngozi stepped out first, scanning the area. He should be here soon. Juliet and David followed cautiously, their eyes darting around the dark surroundings. The tension was suffocating, each shadow feeling like a threat waiting to pounce. Then, footsteps echoed from the far end of the alley. A tall figure emerged from the darkness, wearing a long coat and a serious expression. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze settling on Ngozi. "Ngozi," he greeted, his voice low and steady. "You look like hell." Ngozi smirked. "And you look exactly the same, Tund." Tund's eyes flickered to Juliet and David. "You must be the ones in trouble." David nodded. "More than you can imagine." Tund took a deep breath. "Then let's not waste time. Follow me." Juliet glanced at David before stepping forward. This was their only shot at survival. She just hoped it wasn't another trap. Juliet, David, and Ngozi followed Tund through a maze of alleys, their footsteps echoing against the silent walls. The air was thick with tension, every sound making Juliet's heart race. She didn't know if they were running to safety or walking into another trap. Tund finally stopped in front of an old warehouse with a rusted metal door. He knocked twice in a distinct pattern. A few seconds later, the door creaked open, revealing a young woman with sharp eyes and a pistol in her grip. "Tund," she greeted, stepping aside to let them in. "You brought company." "They need a safe place," Tund said as he led them inside. "For now." Juliet scanned the space. The warehouse was dimly lit, with crates stacked along the walls and a few worn-out chairs scattered around. It didn't look like much, but right now, anywhere was better than being on the streets. The woman studied them carefully before lowering her pistol. "I'm Amaka. If you're with Tund, I assume you're in trouble." Ngozi exhaled. "That's putting it lightly." David ran a hand through his hair. "We just need to lay low for a while. Scarface and his men won't stop hunting us." Amaka's expression hardened. "Then you're not safe here for long. We'll need to move you before they figure this place out." Juliet felt a chill run down her spine. "Move us where?" Tund exchanged a glance with Amaka before answering. "There's a place outside the city, a safe house. No one knows about it." Ngozi crossed her arms. "How sure are you?" Amaka smirked. "Because I built it." A heavy silence followed. Juliet wanted to believe they had finally caught a break, but something inside her whispered that this wasn't the end. Scarface wasn't the type to give up easily. "Ton is sight. We leave at dawn. Get some rest while you can." Juliet sat down, exhaustion pulling at her limbs. She closed her eyes, knowing that tomorrow they would be on the run again. And this time, there might not be another chance to escape. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in soft hues of orange and pink as Juliet rubbed her tired eyes. She had barely slept, her mind tangled with worry. Scarface and his men were relentless, and even with Tund and Amaka's help, the danger still loomed over them like a dark cloud. David was already awake, checking his gun, while Ngozi whispered in low tones with Tund. Amaka stood near the warehouse entrance, scanning the empty streets outside. "It's time," Tund said, turning to face them. "We move now before anyone gets wind of where we are." Juliet nodded, her stomach tightening with anxiety. She had no idea what lay ahead, but staying wasn't an option. They moved in silence, exiting the warehouse one by one. A van was parked a few meters away, its engine already running. Amaka gestured for them to get in. "This will get us to the safe house, but we can't afford any stops." David helped Juliet into the van before climbing in himself. Ngozi and Tund followed, while Amaka took the driver's seat. The moment the doors shut, she pressed the accelerator, and the van sped off into the quiet streets. Juliet stared out the window, her fingers gripping the seat tightly. The city was waking up, oblivious to the chaos that had unraveled in the night. She envied the people walking freely, unaware of the danger lurking in the shadows. Half an hour into the drive, Amaka suddenly tensed. "We've got company." Juliet's heart lurched as she glanced in the side mirror. A black SUV was tailing them, closing the distance fast. Tund cursed under his breath. "They found us." Without hesitation, Amaka took a sharp turn, tires screeching against the asphalt. "Hold on." The van swerved through narrow alleys, dodging pedestrians and carts. The SUV stayed right on their tail, relentless. Ngozi pulled out her gun, rolling down the window. "We can't outrun them forever." David reached for his weapon. "Then we fight." Juliet's breath hitched. She had hoped they had escaped, but now survival meant facing the danger head-on. Season 2, Part 10. Amaka gritted her teeth as she swerved the van through another tight alley, barely missing a stack of crates. The black SUV behind them was relentless, its headlights cutting through the early morning haze. Juliet clutched her seat, her heart pounding like a drum. "They're not letting up." Tun growled, loading his gun. Ngozi had her gun ready, eyes sharp as she peeked through the window. "We need to take them out before they box us in." David unbuckled his seatbelt and moved to the back of the van. "I'll slow them down," he said, gripping his weapon. Juliet reached for his arm, fear flashing in her eyes. "Be careful." David gave her a reassuring nod before opening the van's back door slightly. The rush of wind nearly knocked him off balance. He took aim and fired at the SUV's tires. The first shot missed, but the second struck, causing the vehicle to swerve slightly. "They're still coming," Juliet shouted. Amaka took another sharp turn, leading them onto a deserted highway. "If we can get to the bridge ahead, I can lose them in the old docks." The SUV accelerated, closing the gap. More gunfire erupted, bullets piercing through the back window. Juliet screamed and ducked as shards of glass scattered everywhere. Tund fired back, hitting one of the pursuers in the shoulder. The SUV jerked to the side, but quickly regained control. "We can't keep this up," Amaka yelled. David gritted his teeth and steadied his hand. He aimed at the front tire of the SUV and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, and the tire exploded, sending the vehicle spinning out of control. It skidded off the road, crashing into a barricade. Amaka didn't slow down. She pushed the van to its limits, speeding toward the docks. Juliet turned back, watching the wrecked SUV in the distance, smoke rising from its hood. "They'll send more," Ngozi warned, reloading her weapon. "We need to disappear before they regroup." Juliet swallowed hard, gripping David's hand. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The van raced through the dimly lit streets, the docks looming ahead. Amaka didn't let up, pushing the vehicle to its limits. The tension inside was thick, every breath heavy with anticipation. "We're almost there," Amaka muttered, gripping the wheel tightly. Ngozi reloaded her gun. "No time to relax. They'll send more after us." Juliet clutched David's arm, her fingers trembling. "What if they find us before we get to the safe house?" Tund, who had been quiet all along, finally spoke. "Then we make sure they don't leave here alive." David exchanged a glance with him and nodded. "We stand our ground." Amaka swerved into a hidden warehouse, killing the engine. "This is it. We can regroup here." Everyone jumped out, weapons ready. The air smelled of rust and salt water, the sound of distant ships echoing in the night. Juliet's heart pounded as she scanned the shadows. "We don't have much time," Amaka said, closing the van's doors. "We lay low. Find another way out." A sudden noise made them all freeze. Footsteps, multiple. "They're here," Ngozi whispered, raising her gun. David pulled Juliet behind a stack of crates. "Stay close to me." The metal doors creaked as they were pushed open, and Scarface's voice cut through the silence. "You can't run forever." Juliet's breath hitched. They were trapped. Tund cocked his gun. "Then we fight." Juliet's breath came in short gasps as she pressed her back against the cold metal crate. The sound of Scarface's boots echoed through the warehouse, his men spreading out like a hunting pack. Ngozi signaled to Tund, who nodded in understanding. They were outnumbered, but they had the element of surprise. Scarface's voice rang through the darkness. "Give it up, David. There's nowhere left to run." David clenched his jaw. "We're not running." Before Scarface could react, Ngozi fired the first shot, hitting one of his men in the shoulder. Chaos erupted as bullets ricocheted off the metal walls, sparks flying. Tund took down another attacker, moving with lethal precision. Juliet ducked as a crate shattered beside her. David pulled her close, shielding her from flying debris. "Stay with me," he whispered. Amaka flanked left, taking out another gunman. "We need to get to the exit," she shouted over the gunfire. Scarface roared in frustration. "Finish them off." Juliet felt a surge of determination. She grabbed a nearby metal rod and swung it at an approaching thug, knocking him out cold. Tund kicked over a barrel, creating a momentary blockade. "Go now." David led Juliet through the narrow passage, Amaka and Ngozi covering them. As they neared the exit, Scarface fired wildly, his rage blinding his aim. Juliet turned back to see Ngozi fire a perfect shot, hitting Scarface square in the chest. He staggered, his gun falling from his grip as he collapsed. Silence followed. The remaining thugs fled, leaving their fallen leader behind. Ngozi took a deep breath. "It's over." Juliet clutched David's hand, disbelief washing over her. They had survived. Amaka smirked. "Time to disappear for good." Tund nodded. "Let's go." As they stepped into the cool night air, Juliet knew this wasn't just an escape. It was a new beginning.